Welcome to the Education Insights Focus on Behavior podcast. We're here to talk about all things behavior in the world of education. We take the science of behavior and break it down for educators into easily implementable steps, and we're excited to spend some time with you. Get ready to talk through behavior, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can all improve our work in schools so we as educators can be more fulfilled and our students can be more successful.
Welcome to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden, and as always, I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Daniel Irwin. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
And Dr. Daria Lorio Barston. Hi, Daria.
Hi, everyone.
And we are always happy to have with us our producer, Emily Muse. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
This is one of our special episodes of our podcast where we're going to take a deep dive into one of the 7 dimensions of the science of behavior. If you've heard our previous episodes on this, you probably already know this, but to give a little context, back in 1968, there was an article published by Bear, Wolf, and Risley in the first issue of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. That article, Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, is really a seminal article in the field of behavior analysis and goes into each of the 7 dimensions. They are applied, behavioral, analytic, technological, conceptual systems, affective, and generality. These help to inform the science of behavior that we focus on. So today, we're going to focus specifically on the dimension of analytic. So who wants to take a crack at talking about what that means?
I'll do it. So in the article, the quote is that there be a believable demonstration of the events that can be responsible for the occurrence or non-occurrence of that behavior. And so from kind of this applied setting or this applied kind of context that we're thinking about using applied behavior analysis, it's really are our interventions responsible for the changes in behavior that we're seeking, right? And so that's kind of the big idea. And I really, in kind of thinking about this, I really like the word believable demonstration, right? Because I think for some of us who provide technical assistance in schools or supporting teachers or supporting families, we can talk all day long about why interventions would, should, could, may work. But if we can't demonstrate and make people believe that the things we've put in place are responsible for those behavior changes, we're less likely to see fidelity in implementation or buy-in from a team or sort of build a trust that we know what we're talking about and we're here to help our clients, students, families, whoever. So basically, can we turn the behavior on? Can we turn the behavior off? Can we make the behavior happen more often, less often? In an example, I have an example, and this is a long time ago. I was working with a student. We were waiting. His bus was late or something like that. He was the only kid left at the school. And so there were a lot of staff kind of milling around talking, and we, to kind of keep him entertained, had a dance party. And he was new to us and seemed to be very responsive to social interaction and praise, right? So we're having this dance party and he does like a certain dance move where he like kind of gets almost like a burpee. He does like this burpee kind of like I'm down on the floor, then back up again. And I was like, let's see, we think he's motivated by social interaction. So if he does that again, let's all clap. And so he does it again, we all clap. He kind of looks around and he does it again and we all clap. And so it was a really immediate demonstration that, yeah, this is certainly motivating for this kid. And we were able to demonstrate in real time. Was it practical? Was it usable? Not for the student, but maybe for the staff who saw like this is how important social interaction is for him. Anyway, we were able to turn it on, turn it off. And it was pretty neat.
Daniel, I dub this move an excited worm because as you're describing it, right, like our listeners who can't see us are probably just wondering what exactly it is that you're talking about it. But I love this. And I do think that that is a great illustration, actually, of this ability to essentially control the behavior, right? And I don't mean this like in a negative aspect of controlling, but I just mean it that there's a very solid connection between this is the conditions which preempt this behavior occurring, right? So I think the clapping and the dance definitely connect. If our listeners have been following this particular kind of episodes along, I'm wondering if they're thinking about whether this was socially significant behavior or not. If you haven't heard that one, you might want to check out that episode on the applied dimension. But I do think going back to the analytical piece is you bring up this good place about this good point about, well, how do we know that it's the specific events that are responsible for occurrence or the non-occurrence of the behavior, right? So yes, it seems like that, but what are the ways that we can actually be sure and be able to analyze and confirm that this is indeed a believable demonstration of behavior?
Daria, before we get into the answer to that, I think one of the questions that comes up a lot is, well, I put all these interventions in place. Of course, that's what's responsible for changing the behavior that we see. And so just to give a couple of like really practical examples where we thought maybe what we were doing is making the difference, but it really wasn't. I had a kid that was engaging in some interfering behaviors that we didn't really want to see, and a lot of self-injury and that kind of thing. And so clearly socially significant that we should work on this. We don't want anyone to hurt themselves. And so we did, a functional behavior assessment. We designed this really great intervention. We were implementing it with fidelity. We saw great change in behavior. We were like, oh, this is great. Everything we're doing is working. And we come into the meeting with the mom to talk about how things are going. And she's like, that's all really awesome. And she's like really supportive. And then she's like, I just need you to know we started medication on this date. And I'm like, well, darn, now we don't know if it's what we're doing or if it's what the medication did. And it might be both. We don't know. And we will never know what the actual catalyst for that behavior change was. Now, there are still things we can do to determine, like, is the medication what's making the change? Is it what's us? But we won't know that initial, like, what made that change. And I think that's just a really, actually pretty common and practical example of we don't always know what's responsible for the behavior change if we're not being careful and conscientious of how we're implementing things and taking that data. So I know we're going to go into ways to do that, but go ahead, Daria. I know you have another point.
I do. Well, and to that point, I think when we think about schools and classrooms as environments, there are so many things that are happening at the same time that could account for some of those things, right? Um, I think when we factor in the behavior of the peers and the teachers and all sorts of social events that are happening, that we might think it's our brilliant interventions that are having effect. But as you said, it could be something completely unrelated that is happening within the classroom that we can't see, or we haven't even been able to make that as a connection. You know, yeah, just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have another quick example of this. We started, there was a kid I was working with having a really hard time with reading. So we started this very direct instruction program with them to help increase their reading skills. Well, at the same time, unbeknownst to us, there was this school-wide reading initiative, right? Where they suddenly started increasing the amount of reading time that was going on in the general education classroom. Parents were encouraged to read at home. There was like a little contest the kids were having if you read X number of books, that kind of thing. Now, do I believe that the direct instruction led to better reading skills for this kid? Yes, but I can't say that that was the sole impact because all of a sudden their exposure to reading was just so much higher because of things going on naturally in the school. It doesn't mean what we did is wrong or bad. I just don't know what made the exact difference. And it may have been the direct instruction, it may have been greater exposure and practice opportunities, or it may have been both in conjunction with each other. And we just don't know because we weren't able to control for those variables. And that's what you were talking about earlier, not control in like the bad way, but in like knowing what is making a difference. And sometimes we have to put things in place in pieces for that, or we have to, we're going to try this and then see how that works, those kinds of things.
Right. So Selena, in another example, I have a wonderful teacher friend who was sharing with me that she saw a really significant uptick in some interfering behaviors in her classroom, and she couldn't quite figure out because her instruction hadn't changed, the classroom expectations hadn't changed, right? She was swearing up and down that she was very consistent in her application, but yet she saw just more and more students engaging in some lighthearted shenanigans, right? Nothing hurtful, but just it seemed to be a little bit outside of their typical behavior in the classroom. So it took her a while to figure out that that was happening in many of our schools, particularly that implement MTSS or PBIS. There's usually some sort of tokens or tickets that kids can exchange at the school store, right? So these particular tickets were apparently pretty popular amongst the students because they started engaging in dares in order to obtain more of the tickets before the school store would open. So the teachers' practices hadn't changed, but the underground bets that were apparently happening in the bathrooms had started happening, which is what actually was the event responsible for the occurrence of interfering behaviors, right? So a lot of times we can analyze our practices in depth and be very, very specific about what we're doing and not know about some of those other events that might be happening.
The best of intentions, right?
Absolutely.
So in the article, they actually talk about two very specific ways to kind of determine whether what you're doing is responsible for the change of behavior. And while I'm not sure that these are always necessary or feasible within a school setting, I do think it's worth talking about them. So the first one is called a reversal design. And I'm not sure if one of you want to kind of talk us through what that means.
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. A reversal basically means that if we've put something in place, an intervention, and we think that that intervention is responsible for the change in behavior, that if we withdraw that intervention or remove that intervention, then if it is causally responsible for the change of behavior, we see the behavior go back to levels that it was prior to that intervention. And it can be really, it can really help that believability component of, is this the thing that's working to make the behavior change for us, right? That said, it's very difficult to, it's really difficult to withdraw effective treatments for kids when they're working, right? I mean, it's is it ethical to withdraw if we Selena, you mentioned someone who was engaging in self-injurious behavior. Is it ethical for us to withdraw a treatment and then they go back to engaging in that self-injurious behavior and say, "Hey, told you," and then put the intervention back in place? And so, you know, it's an ethical thought. It's an ethical thing we have to consider, but I think, there's some natural opportunities that this may come up in a school setting. And one of those is really thinking about when plans are in place and we've built in interventions for kids, is this idea of treatment drift, that the adult behavior, the implementation of the plan, regardless of how well written it is and how well trained, we tend to see treatment drift and how people are responding, the frequency, the type of response they're providing, and how they're implementing the plan. And so what we might see is, if that treatment drift starts to happen and we're moving away from the fidelity of the plan, we might see that behavior increase a little bit. And one of our actions might be to, let's go back and make sure that we're observing what's happening with the plan. Is it being implemented with fidelity? And if it's not, how do we get it back to where it needs to be? That could also be an indicator, if then the behavior subsides or increases like we wanted it to, that the treatment's effective and the treatment is, or the intervention is, the thing that's causing that change in behavior. So we might not directly say we're going to withdraw, this kid's token system or whatever it is, but those opportunities might come around as the environment changes a little bit or as the treatment fidelity shifts over time.
Well, and Daniel, I think the other thing with the reversal technique is I appreciate how you frame it in both terms of fidelity and the ethics part of that, right? Because I think sometimes if we pull back a little bit, it'll give us an insight to see if our fidelity isn't solid. Does that make a difference? And the reversal of that is true, where sometimes we are not seeing the behavior occurring, but it is not because the intervention isn't working, it's because of that implementation drift, right? I think the other piece that we have to consider in the context of the school is that there are some interventions that we really can't do a reversal technique for because it's not likely that once gained, a specific skill can be undone, right? I mean, we certainly can unlearn lots of things, but unlearning how to read, once you have learned how to read, is not really realistic. I mean, I'm sure under some circumstances it can happen. But my point is there are some skills that once you have them and they become a big part of your life, you can't really reverse them and see that result. And so I do want to make sure that our listeners are aware that the reversal technique isn't the only way that you can kind of test and see if that believable demonstration is solid, right? So the authors also offer an example of a multiple baseline design technique. And so, Selena, would you like to talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so real quick before we leave reversal, just in case we have any aspiring behavior analysts out there, this has a lot of different names. It's called a reversal design, a withdrawal design, an AB design. So it goes by lots of different names. And it's a really strong empirical design that really does demonstrate whether what you're doing is making the difference or not. But as we've kind of discussed, there are some challenges with it. One being feasibility. And two, Daria's point is a really important point. There are just some skills you can't reverse. You can't stop reading. I mean, you can refuse to read, but you still have the skill to read. You still have the skill to add numbers. And so once you learn those things, you don't suddenly not have those things in your repertoire anymore. And then the third thing, which is also a really important point, is that ethical consideration. There are times where it's probably no big deal to reverse the design and see what happens to the behavior. But there are times, particularly when we're dealing with things like self-injurious behavior, behavior that can hurt other people, those kinds of things, that we would not want to do this because we don't want to see those behaviors return, right? And so a multiple baseline is another option that the authors discuss. And a multiple baseline design basically requires that you have at least 3 demonstrations. Now, what that means can vary. So you can do a multiple baseline over behavior, you can do a multiple baseline over people, you can do a multiple baseline over environments. There's different ways you can do this, but you have to have at least 3 demonstrations. So with a multiple baseline, let's pretend we're doing it across 3 different people, because I think that one's kind of the easy one to understand. All 3 people, you start taking data of baseline data. So you're not doing any implementation yet, just where is behavior currently on all 3 people at the same time. So the same starting point, we start taking that data. After we have enough data points to determine what baseline levels are for participant 1 or student 1, we then start implementing the intervention for that person only. While we're doing that, we continue to take baseline data for the second and third individuals. After that first person reaches whatever criteria we have set, then we start the intervention for the second individual. So the first individual is now done because they've mastered whatever criteria we set. The second individual, we are now taking data on the intervention while we continue to take baseline data on individual number 3. And we follow this pattern until all the individuals are through the intervention. Why this demonstrates experimental control, which is ultimately what we're looking for, is because what should happen is the baselines should stay stable for all participants who are not receiving the intervention. If we see major changes in the behavior in the participants that are supposed to be in baseline still, while a different individual is in intervention, there's some confounding variable that's causing that behavior to increase. So if I go back to my reading example, if we had been taking data on 3 different students and we did the intervention for student 1 and we found that, hey, their reading ability increased, that's great. And then we found that the baseline stayed stable for participant 2 and participant 3 until we implemented our intervention, even though all this other stuff is going on around with the parent reading and the exposure in school and all of that, we can still say what we did was responsible for the change of behavior because we didn't see a change in behavior until we implemented our intervention across those 3 individuals. But if suddenly we started seeing behavior change while people were in baseline, we could not then say that. And the reason you have to stagger when the interventions happen is because of this same issue. If we started the intervention at the same time for all 3 people, there could be some other event that's influencing that behavior, and we wouldn't know because we don't have data to show us that. So it's kind of a really quick overview of a multiple baseline. And if you want more information, there is far more out there. But hopefully that gives a brief overview.
Yeah, Selena, so I that last point you made about kind of making sure things are staggered, like if you started these interventions the week before winter break, right? Like you're not going to get, but if you could see someone who started in October versus November versus right before, then you could see those clear patterns. And as you were talking, I was thinking, in thinking about supporting schools with multi-tiered systems of support, really thinking about like that tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and if kids need to move into a tier 2 intervention, and maybe I'm asking a question to the group here. Could we look at that as sort of a multiple baseline in that they've gone through, assuming our whole system is working with some level of fidelity, you move into tier 2, maybe it's a check in, check out, and we see, the kids doing great. Let's now start withdrawing some of that tier 2 because they've done well, they've shown some progress over time. And so it's not necessarily time defined, but it really is sort of based on some criteria. Daria's eyebrow. So you all don't have a visual of this, but Daria is thinking very hard. Could that kind of set itself up as some level of a modified or alternate multiple baseline, because our students aren't necessarily going to a higher level of intervention at the same time. And obviously there's individual differences, but are we seeing students move into tier 2 and then be able to transition back into tier 1 supports versus, am I making sense?
You are. I actually would argue that's probably more of a reversal design, right? Because you are taking data at tier 1, like wherever you are. They go into tier 2, you apply some intervention, and then you come back to you withdraw that
It's like the
intervention and
AB.
see
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah.
happens. Now, hopefully what that means is that you've created behavior that won't change over time. And so it is tricky. And I'm not sure that either of those is really the best design for that because there are some others that I can allude to in a minute, but I know Daria has a comment.
Yeah, so it just took me, I did have a furrowed brow for a second there because I was trying to figure out if we were really mixing things that we shouldn't mix, if we are comparing like students who are receiving only tier 1 and then students receiving only tier 2. But then it took me a second to catch on with Daniel's brilliance. And so what I think he was saying, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Oh, he's not going to correct you now. He's like,
No,
yes,
you
that is
just said it was
exactly what I
brilliant.
would
So
say.
whatever,
Yeah, that's
however
true,
you
right?
interpreted what I
See?
said is,
Well,
yep.
well played, Daria. Well played. But I think what I think I heard you say, or at least what my brain interpreted this to mean, is that a lot of times our students who require tier 2 support, like let's say check in, check out, don't all start it at the same time. Because as the teams meet, and let's say in September, it's very obvious that little Daria needs some check in, check out, but it may be until November that little Selena requires that support and the team identifies her, which then I'm just following along your trail of thinking, then it does create the multiple baseline in a way because the when we start implementing that intervention is a bit staggered. Is that what I think you were saying?
that's kind of what I was getting at, but I also like I'm thinking about what Selena said, and typically, ideally, we're looking at data trends before we're pulling the intervention, which to me would lead it, and I don't know research design, but it's based on the student behavior rather than sort of some predetermined time. And so our decision making is based not on calendars or trying to make sure we have this many days between our starting and our pulling of it. It's really about the data. It's data informed decision making. So
I
I don't know
think
where that fits.
I think this is a perfect illustration of this thing that we all as BCBAs in schools struggle with is the, as I like to call it, like clean data or the obvious experimental control versus the context of a school that comes with all the complexities, like the breaks, like the what other students are doing, like the changing staff, and all of those are the pieces. And so I think when we talk about analytical, and particularly when we start getting into the single subject designs, right? I think this is where that tension becomes really tricky and it may look differently. So if you are a special education teacher who is developing very individualized plans, then it makes sense to take data in a particular way and look, you may have a little bit more room for some of that single subject experimental design. Whereas if you are in a general education setting and you're trying to do more group interventions potentially, then that may become trickier if we're talking about the research design itself, right? And again, we get to that point where these are really, really powerful designs to demonstrate that experimental control. But I think the feasibility of that in our school setting sometimes is tricky. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think it does get a little bit more challenging due to the context.
Yeah, and I do want to take us back to the article because they actually address this a little bit. And one of the things that they talk about is that reliability can be a challenge with applied interventions, but it's still really important because what we don't want to do is throw the kitchen sink of interventions at our students and then not know what's maintaining that because we do see treatment drift, we see behavioral drift, we see some of these things, and we're not going to know what's keeping us, what changed that behavior. And so then we don't know what pieces to keep and what pieces to drop. But reliability really should still be one of our primary concerns. And so we have to think about how we're addressing that. Um, I would be remiss if I don't mention this. So this article was written in 1968, and these were two very well documented designs at that time. Um, Over the years, there are other designs that also can be used to demonstrate this kind of level of believability or believable demonstration that we're talking about. And I'm not going to go into them in depth by any means, but if you're interested, there's alternating treatment designs, there's changing criterion designs, there's a multiple probe design. So there's some other ways to look at this. There's others as well. If you pick up a single case design book, I'm sure that you will find all of them probably go through at least most, if not all of these. But there are pros and cons to every single design that you use. And so you have to kind of think about your environment. What do you have the ability to control and not control, and what makes sense for what you're trying to do, given what is the behavior? Are there ethical concerns? Some of those kinds of pieces. So I think there's lots of opportunity for this. But I also put the caveat out here. If you don't know what you're doing with these, don't go implement them tomorrow. It's really important when you're doing any kind of research design, whether it's single case design, group design, qualitative design, it doesn't matter. If you don't know what you're doing, don't go try it out by yourself. This is where you really do need to find someone who has this expertise, who can help walk you through it, who can do it with you side by side, who can teach you so that you can do it in a way that one is ethical and two, our utmost concern is we need to protect our participants. I'm using air quotes, our students, whoever it is that we're, using our interventions with. So that's my little sidebar caveat. But I think that brings us to the end of our conversation on analytical. This one was a pretty heavy episode because I know we got into research design, but I think it's hopefully really helpful to kind of see some of the things that a lot of us have to think about as we are trying to decide, like, is what we're doing working? Is it not is what we're doing not working? And how does this fit within that science of behavior? So with that, Daniel and Daria, thank you.
Great chat. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Emily, thank you so much for your support.
Thank you.
And I hope that we will have our listeners back with us on our next episode.
Thanks for listening to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can join the conversation by emailing us at cbis@odu.edu, visiting www.cbisva.org, or following us on Facebook, Instagram, X, or Blue Sky at CBISVA. Special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for their support of this project.